Thanks for downloading this episode of Bionic Planet, a podcast of the Anthropocene. If you listen to audiobooks as well, be sure to visit audibletrial.com/Bionic Planet for a free 30-day trial to audible.com. The address again is audibletrial.com/Bionic Planet. Both Audible Trial and Bionic Planet are spelled out as one word, no dots, dashes, or spaces, as opposed to my website, which is bionic-planet.com. Towards the end of summer, climate negotiators learned of 3 trademark applications that were filed in May of this year. One was for the logo REDDPLUSX, which is described as a carbon credit brokerage. Another was for the logo RRU, which is supposed to be a new type of carbon credit generated by saving or supporting forests under the Paris Agreement. But it was the third, for the logo REDD Plus, that raised eyebrows across the climate community.
This is kind of a sketchy-looking business proposal.
Man may be unwittingly changing the world's climate through the waste products of his civilization.
There's a group of us now who are proposing that the Earth has actually entered a new epoch, and that is the Anthropocene.
We know that the enemy is carbon, and we know its ugly face. We should put a big fat price on it, and of course, add to that, drop the subsidies.
Earth, we broke it, we own it, and nothing is as it was. Not the trees, not the seas, not the forests, farms, or fields, and not the global economy that depends on all of these. But we can restore it, make it better, greener, more resilient, more sustainable. But how? Technology? Geoengineering? Are we doomed to live on a bionic planet, or is nature itself the answer? That's the question we address in every episode of Bionic Planet, a podcast of the Anthropocene, the new epoch defined by man's impact on Earth. And today we're coming to you from year-end climate talks in Bonn, Germany, where negotiations are still ongoing, but we're going to take a look at one of those quirky little disputes that rarely make it into the mainstream media, but that actually say a lot about how complex these negotiations are. Specifically, we're looking at what happened to 2 proposals that haven't even made it into the formal negotiating process, but that touch on issues around the implementation of a mechanism that we've discussed a lot on Bionic Planet, namely REDD+, which is a set of activities that reduce greenhouse gases by saving or reviving endangered forests. The acronym is generally spelled out as reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation and the role of conservation, sustainable management of forests, and enhancement of forest carbon stocks. It's a mouthful, and it describes a set of mechanisms that generate so-called reduction units, which might one day be worth billions of dollars as the world implements the Paris Climate Agreement. It's getting late here in Bonn. The beer is flowing, and as you can hear, the music's playing, and I'm having a hard time concentrating after a week of 12-hour work days. But I need to get this thing filed tonight, or I'm afraid it will never get done. And yes, I've had a few beers myself, and I hope I don't sound like an idiot. I'm going to get a little wonky today, and I probably won't be doing a very good job of introducing some of these concepts. I've got a feeling this is one of those episodes that I'll be remixing or harvesting for a more accessible feature when I have time. Now, we start in May of this year, when a New York-based entity called the Coalition for Rainforest Nations applied to trademark the term REDD+, along with the terms REDDPLUSX and RRU. The coalition has been around a while. It's a nonprofit organization that promotes forest carbon initiatives in roughly 24 countries. And the trademark applications came to light just as one of those countries, the Democratic Republic of Congo, proposed something that it's calling a gateway for handling REDD Plus reduction units, which, not coincidentally, is what RRU stands for. And that, as you may recall from a few seconds ago, is one of the terms they wanted to trademark. This got negotiators flipping out. But Kevin Conrad, who runs the Coalition for Rainforest Nations, says he's just trying to provide clarity in a process that often seems chaotic. His critics say the proposals replicate mechanisms that are already in the works, and more than a few of them have pointed out to me that the person who trademarks a logo gets to charge for its use. Conrad, however, says he's offering these logos for free as a tool that we can all use to differentiate different types of offsets. Now, I'm not a mind reader, and I can't speak to the motives of the people involved in this little kerfuffle, but I do think it offers an opportunity to help you understand the issues that negotiators wrestle with. So today, we're speaking with Kevin Conrad, as well as Tosi Mpanupanu, who is the Democratic Republic of Congo's chief climate negotiator, and Peter Graham, a former Canadian negotiator, now in the private sector, and as a result, free to speak his mind as he wasn't before. We'll start with Kevin, but first some background. REDDPLUS began as an experiment in 1988 when a company called Applied Energy Services wanted to see if it could reduce its carbon footprint by helping farmers in Guatemala manage their land more sustainably. The acronym then was AD, for avoided deforestation, and the concept evolved over the decades as NGOs continued to experiment with the science. Eventually, the phrase shifted to reducing emissions from deforestation, then to reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, and finally to one that includes a broader range of land use activities. At the same time, standard-setting bodies like the Verified Carbon Standard, which you'll hear referred to as VCS, and the American Carbon Registry emerged to provide ways of generating carbon offsets by determining which forests were endangered and which procedures can be used to save them. So that was going on in one stream. But within the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, REDD, and again that's REDD, remained on ice until 2005. And it was Kevin Conrad, today's guest, who got it back into the agenda. Now, he grew up in Papua New Guinea, and he was that country's lead negotiator in 2005, and he wrangled REDDPLUS back onto the agenda. That was at the climate talks in Montreal. Now, 8 years later, at the 2013 climate talks in Warsaw, the UNFCCC agreed on something called the Warsaw Framework for REDDPLUS. This is a cluster of agreements on how countries can develop a kind of environment within which REDDPLUS projects can proliferate. I'm adjusting that definition for today's show, but that is one of the. It wasn't like the main goal, but that's the relevant part. That rule book was enshrined in the Paris Agreement, which was which was passed in 2015. But the acronym REDDPLUS is used by carbon standards like VCS and Plan Vivo, and it's also used by states within countries, like the U.S. state of California and the Mexican state of Chiapas. And that, says Conrad, is a problem. I'm posting our interview raw. The only edits I made are adjusting the volume levels and snipping out a few ums and ahs. At this point, the whole REDD system under the United Nations, we don't even have offsets being generated yet. But they do exist under the Verified Carbon Standard and other carbon standards, and the problem that you're having is that people think that if they're buying a REDD offset, that it's automatically something that's sanctioned by the United Nations.
The first part of your comment I disagree with, and the second part I agree with. So I agree with the fact that when the VCS uses the word REDDPLUS, they're misleading customers. Customers think that's part of the UNFCCC process, which is called REDDPLUS, but it isn't. Okay, REDDPLUS under the UNFCCC is a very complex and lengthy process that includes national reference levels, and that's really important for environmental integrity. And when you said the UNFCCC hasn't created credits, that's true and not true. What the UNFCCC has done, it has certified tons or verified tons of emission reductions for REDD countries. Brazil has about 1 billion tons that have been verified, and they're publicly listed on the UNFCCC's REDD+ hub. Ecuador has about 20 million tons that have been verified by the UNFCCC. And there are at least 27 other countries that are actually actively going through that process now. The question that you've raised is, well, what do those countries do with those tons? And that's what we have some thoughts on.
Right. Because these are tons generated at the national level because over their jurisdiction they've reduced their rates of deforestation, right?
Well, not generated by the government. The government just reports on the emission reductions by everybody. Right? So that's part of what the government's responsibility is to do. After it receives those tons, it has to devolve or assign those tons to the people who actually did the work. Okay? So that process means that the national government may keep some of those tons for programs it put in place. It may devolve some of those to states. And it may devolve those to communities or corporations or all of those actors who actually helped the government through its reporting system achieve those reductions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but none of those emission reductions were created on a specific patch of land, like under the verified carbon standard, for example. The way you would create an offset is you identify a specific piece of territory that's under some sort of threat, and then you have to go in and map out the threat, and then you have to go create all these models, and then say, okay, this is what's going to happen if we don't intervene. Then they'll intervene, and then they'll have a very specific emission reduction for a very specific piece of territory. There's nothing like that actually within the UNFCCC yet, right? Or is it?
Not true. What the UNFCCC requires countries to do is to report all of those areas where actions are happening, and also report all of the areas where actions aren't happening and forests are being lost, and net them out. Okay? And actually that's the right response, because that's what the atmosphere sees. The atmosphere sees the reductions in one area, and it also sees the losses in another area. So the obligation of the national governments is to report wins and losses and to net them out, and then to receive benefit for the net.
Your issue is that big banks, investors generally don't know the difference between an offset that's generated in the voluntary market and these credits that are going to be coming out under the UNFCCC.
That's true. What has happened, unfortunately, is a lot of the voluntary project developers have used the REDD+ description. And the REDD+ description describes a UNFCCC process. It's a very lengthy process, and I'll describe it very quickly. You have to have a national plan, you have to have a national monitoring system, you have to have a national reference level, you have to write a report on all of your safeguards, and then you submit your results, and then those results have to be independently reviewed by the UNFCCC itself, and then once it goes through that process, then they are issued and put on the REDD+ hub. Now, none of these projects have gone through that process, which means they actually shouldn't be calling themselves REDD+ projects.
Now, so what you're advocating is the creation of a logo or a certification program or basically another standard. You want to take what's happening under the UNFCCC, turn that into a very clearly delineated standard that everyone can see.
Yes. What we'd like to do is sort of create a REDD+ logo, and then also a name of a unit, and we're using RRU, which is REDD+ Results Unit, that we would assign only to those units that are coming out of the UNFCCC process and have met all of the international agreed standards and have been verified according to the best international standards. And only those units would be able to use the logo and carry the RRU designation.
Mm-hmm. And if I understand correctly, what your main concern on these voluntary offsets is just that they're not always part of a national accounting program. If VCS or one of the other standards, I just keep using them because they're the biggest, but if one of the standards does work something out where they say, okay, we're doing these voluntary offsets, but we're coordinating closely with the government, and everything, every emission reduction that we generate is registered with the government.
Well, I think what you're getting at, Steve, is that there's no reason projects that were previously termed VCS cannot become part of the new system, right? So those land areas that are active in conserving forest areas, if they then work with the government, become part of the national, be covered by the national reference level, get included in the national greenhouse gas inventory reports, and are part then of the registry system so that everyone understands who owns what, there's no reason they can't get that UN certification. The point is, it hasn't happened yet. What we initially and actually still are trying to do is simply signal to non-state actors that speaking the same carbon language is critically important if we're actually trying to pull in the same direction to reduce carbon emissions globally. It's the current situation is more like what I call sort of the carbon Tower of Babel. Everyone is there saying they're trying to build the same structure but speaking a different carbon language, and it becomes a bit of a disaster. And so what we see the NPC is submission is just a simple message to encourage anyone who is not in this process to, when they talk about what they're doing in climate and carbon, try to speak the same language. And I use the GAP, the generally accepted accounting principles, as an analogy. It's when the financial community was trying to evaluate corporations, how real is your debt? How strong are your assets? Are your losses or profits as big as they are? They had to get generally accepted accounting standards so that you could look across companies and begin to understand what they were really doing. And that's all we're advocating here is, let's get the same carbon language and let's encourage people to report on what they're doing in a way that the entire world can understand. And it's a messaging and an encouragement exercise.
Okay. But again, my understanding is that is happening already. You mentioned the IPCC good practice guidance, and my understanding is that the voluntary standards all build on that. They all have the same ways of accounting for carbon stocks and identifying changes in land use. I mean, they are using similar languages, maybe different dialects.
Some are enforced and some aren't, and there's a lot of what I would call room for creativity in the statement. We started with the IPCC good practice guidance, right? So what the IPCC does is it talks about default values, which are called Tier 1. Then it talks about your country-specific values, which are site-specific, which are Tier 2. Then it talks about Tier 3, which is wall-to-wall carbon data. And that's the kind of process that we're saying everyone needs to be involved in.
These high-level negotiations are important, but only because they eventually translate into action on the ground. And you can take action too. But how? Well, I've been listening to an audiobook called Cooler, Smarter, Practical Steps for Low Carbon, which is based on an in-depth 2-year study by experts at the Union of Concerned Scientists. It offers clear, concise descriptions of what we as individuals can do to shrink our own carbon footprints by 20% or more overnight. And you can get the audiobook and support Bionic Planet at the same time with a free 30-day trial by going to audibletrial.com/Bionic Planet. That's audibletrial.com/Bionic Planet, and that's Bionic Planet as a single word with no dots, dashes, or spaces. You can also support Bionic Planet directly by giving me a good 5-star rating on iTunes or wherever you subscribe, or by becoming a patron at bionic-planet.com. Now, I've set the patronage page up so that you can support me per episode, but with a monthly cap. So if you think $5 per month is good for a 5-episode month, you can pledge $1 per episode, but with a $5 monthly cap. That way, if I don't manage to generate 5 episodes in a month, you're not paying for something you didn't get. But if I go nuts and deliver 20 episodes one month, you won't get whacked either. By the same token, you can offer $5 per episode, or $10 or $50 or whatever. I won't complain. My next guest is Tosi Mpanupanu, who's the Democratic Republic of Congo's chief climate negotiator. He's also chairman of the Coalition for Rainforest Nations, and he's the one who formally submitted the proposal to consider something called the Gateway to Encourage, Measure, Report, Verify, and Account for Non-Party Contributions, which I'm just going to call the Gateway. The Paris Agreement doesn't explicitly mention carbon markets at all, but instead it assumes that countries will develop them domestically. The agreement's contribution is to recognize this and to say that countries can trade internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, another one of those crazy acronyms, among themselves to deepen the targets they've set in their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. So ITMOs, internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, basically offsets traded between countries. Nationally determined contributions are essentially a country's climate action plan. Now, Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is what they're still discussing that now as I sit here and try to remain coherent. It lays out two paths that countries can use to trade their emission reductions internationally, and the two paths are not mutually exclusive. The first is called the cooperative approach, which lets countries coordinate trading among themselves, provided they follow accounting principles that pass muster within the UNFCCC. Got that? Okay. The second path, the second path is one that Brazil is championing, and it will be forged within the UNFCCC itself and offer a centralized mechanism for transferring emission reductions. The Gateway seems to suggest something related, more about the quality, but more related to Article 5, which is all about offsets and which is more about carbon offsetting, which is more about REDD in general. But that opens up too many cans of worms for me to get into right now. Mpanupanu sees the Gateway as a platform that will be sanctioned by the UN to ensure the integrity of non-parties. Now, this is another technical term. Non-parties are entities that don't have a seat at the UNFCCC table. They can be cities or states within countries that do have a seat, or they can be companies looking to offset their greenhouse gas emissions. Basically, any entity, even if it's a governmental entity, if it doesn't sit at the UNFCCC table as a negotiator, it's called a non-party. Now, I conducted these interviews a few days ago when no one really knew if the Gateway would become an official agenda item within the talks or not. For now, it looks like that isn't going to happen, again, for now. But it can become a political movement kicking around voluntary meetings. And these, again, are technical terms. Voluntary meetings were sanctioned in 2013 to make sure that outside voices or political movements were being heard in these halls. So I hope I'm not throwing too much at you all at once. I started out by asking Mpanupanu to describe the Gateway.
Yes, basically, our coalition, which consists of 52 countries, was fast to realize that the Paris Agreement, although it was successful, the multilateral system is not sufficient in terms of limiting global temperature rise. So we do need to find ways to increase the level of global ambition. And we have realized also that in our country, forest-free countries, oftentimes we have different private actors who come and implement projects whose quality is unclear, whose outcomes are sometimes unfairly distributed. And for us, it's important that we have a platform, a gateway, where different non-parties, actors, can come and report of what they do. And for us, if what they do commands the highest level of environmental integrity, commands the highest level of rigor, they will be keen on coming and showing what they're doing. So for us, it's not only increases transparency, it also creates a peer pressure for other people to come and follow suit. And for us, it's going to be an important accountability tool that allows us also government to better understand what's taking place on our territory and account for it. For example, the way I see it, it's a poor community in the DRC is lured into some type of project on protection of forest. And once the project is implemented, the project proponent gives them a very small share of the proceeds and then disappears with the carbon assets. So when the DRC now is to report on the implementation of its NDC, the DRC finds itself in a difficult situation where it wants to claim some reductions which are not into its own hands. So by having a platform where everybody comes and reports on what they're doing, it will not only avoid double counting, but it also can allow for some capacity constrained developing countries, parties, to actually know better what their greenhouse gas inventories actually contain. So for me, it is important to find a way, some opportunity to anchor in this formal process a conversation where we can try to account for those non-parties' contributions, because they are out there, they will happen anyway, and it's important for us to rein in all those endeavors and put them under the common umbrella of the Universal Sea, whose rules we do understand. Because as of now, a lot of initiatives are taking place, and it is difficult for us to make a clear assessment of what they can deliver and what they command in terms of integrity and rigor. So basically, for us, we don't see anyone who will be opposing what we're proposing, because not only is it voluntary, but it is also for us to get clarity on who's doing what. And hopefully, with time, we may establish. I'm a little bit afraid to use certain words because I don't want to scare people off, but we may establish some type of standard, but it is one which is owned by all of us, which is not owned by some shady private company, but which is owned by the Universal Sea, that can really guarantee that a project commands the highest level of environmental integrity.
I guess I've got two questions. One is just when you talk about these private sector operators taking off with the carbon assets, does that really happen anymore? I mean, my understanding was that was kind of exaggerated, and that most of the projects now are pretty clean. That the ones that I am familiar with, at least if I'm understanding them right, the project developers might get the carbon benefit, but usually they're creating some kind of sustainable business locally or something to kind of take the pressure off the forest. So there's usually kind of a win-win. It sounds like you're pretty critical. You don't see it that way.
Yeah, very nice narratives have been developed, but really on the ground we don't see that. We don't see the social economic transformation that they pretend to be delivering. We don't see the reporting that they're supposed to bring, and we don't necessarily understand what type of standards they're using. Today there's actually there are dozens and dozens of standards that it completely confuses the investor. Mm-hmm. And the people putting money into this type of project, they don't have peace of mind, because they're not sure whether the project will actually deliver what the environment wants to see, and will transform the lives of the people on the ground, or it is some type of scheme which is going to profit only some few people.
Yeah, I've never visited any projects in DRC, but I have visited some in Kenya, and I do have to say, from what I can see, they generally do. I mean, I've seen evidence of benefits flowing through. So I just want to make it clear that they're not all.
Oh no!
Shady.
No, we should not throw the baby with the bath water. I mean, that's certainly not. Good things are happening, but when you allow for too much flexibility you get what happened in 2007 and 2008, where those so those big banks became so greedy that they produced some products that themselves did not understand, and it created a huge moral hazard. And we don't want to find ourselves in the same situation. I certainly understand that we're not talking about the same thing exactly, but given the right incentive, the bad people will do bad things. So it's important for us to rein in what they're doing and bring it under the common umbrella of the universal policy that we all understand. Let's speak the same language.
Yeah. And I think what I'm not clear on exactly what the proposal does. I know what it aims to achieve, but how does it? Like, what exactly? It's a standard. It's a registry. It's a. What, I'm not quite clear what it is.
It's all of the above, to say, because for us it's going to be a platform, a gateway where you come and you present what you do, and once you have done so, it's going to be measured, verified, reported, and also we're going to ensure that there may be a frequency that also may allow countries, when they do their own reporting, also to be able to do some matching. The important thing is that we want to. It's also going to be a platform that allows people to learn from each other, because if you are the DRC and then you realize that something very ambitious done in Chad, and you're like, if Chad can do it, maybe I can do the same. And also, it also puts more accountability on multinationals, because they will have to report clearly on how they intend, for example, to plan on reducing the emissions and where they intend to do it. So if a multinational establish, I don't know, in the US as activities in the DRC, by then reporting on this platform, the DRC capacity constrained public servants may actually discover that there's a realm of possibility that it was not aware of. But by the reporting of the multinational, it sees that possibilities abound at home.
My final guest is Peter Graham, a longtime negotiator for Canada, who is now a consultant with Climate Advisors. I'd corralled him after speaking to both Kevin and Tosi and to several current negotiators off the record. I actually grabbed Peter to speak about something completely different. He didn't know I'd already spoken to Kevin and Tosi, who, by the way, you may have noticed when I talk about Tosi, I usually use his last name. That's just because this is the first time I met him, so I follow the old journalism convention of using the last name. Anyway, in the middle of my discussion with Peter, I brought up the gateway, and we segued into it. So I kind of pulled this little snippet out of that conversation, and I hope to use that conversation for a later podcast. So here we go.
So that's one of the things I wanted to talk about. I've been involved in RED since it had 1D, and sort of quite committed to the process, and moved from the Warsaw Framework to trying to see it implemented. And with the Paris Agreement, that basically entrenched RED and its rules and the rule book that we got in Warsaw, in that it's basically ready to go. Article 6, cooperative approaches to help countries achieve their NDCs and to go beyond, increase ambition. Article 5 is right there before it, saying, look, and then some of the other decisions in Paris say, look, this is ready to go. RED was designed as a cooperative approach. So that's my key message here when I speak with country delegates who are in different rooms talking about how to operationalize the Article 6, the rules around that. It's like, okay, look, for one set of activities, or sector if you want to call it, the forest and land sector around REDD+, we've actually gone a lot further, and a lot of the questions that you're looking to answer for all the other sectors, we've already dealt with. So we're not asking you to repeat them, and certainly you should avoid repetition, but don't set anything up that contradicts or gets in the way of that. And because so many countries are now implementing action under that structure, that don't do anything to discourage it, and in fact do whatever you can in messaging to encourage it. So then we come to a couple of issues that are happening here that can run the risk of creating the impression that REDD+ is not yet, like the rules and guidelines, is not yet completed. While the gateway is not specifically saying REDD+ in it, for those, I was reviewing it this morning. A country delegate was asking me for my opinion on what this means for them and their activities on REDD+. And when I reviewed it, it was like, okay, I understand the intent. For some countries, there are some project-level activities going on that are voluntary market, voluntary project developers and all that may have started before the government got their act together to create a REDD+ strategy and all the things. And some of them are having a little bit more difficulty or taking a bit more time in working around aligning.
Some of the countries.
Yeah, some of the governments are having some difficulty, or it is taking time to figure out how to align the good projects that are going on with their national strategies and their national inventories and accounting, because sometimes the methodologies that the project are using are different than what the country is using. And so I see this gateway as trying to help in a way to help a country to manage that confusion. Okay, intent, fine. But you start to get into real jurisdictional clashes, where you have an international or external foreign body now trying to create new rules for measurement, reporting, and verification of projects that you may or may not, as a government, recognize in your country. And that body saying, well, they've made this many emission reductions and from this type of activity, and we're going to say those are real, and where the country may not agree. So I have a pretty good guess at this point, it's Thursday, late afternoon, evening here in Bonn, that gateway proposal is going to hit a bit of a wall. And I don't expect it to get out of here. One of the things that, because I've been in this so long and sort of keep my ear to the ground, there is a slightly concerning linkage here, which is around the proponents of this gateway proposal, who have another proposal. Actually, they're seeking to trademark REDD+.
Right.
And I'm drawing this connection because it's not clearly apparent anywhere else unless you connect where it's coming from and the implications. So for a private entity based in Manhattan, I think it's in Manhattan or New York. New York's, yeah. To try and create a trademark of what I would see as a global good. REDD+ was developed under United Nations negotiations. All the parties, 193 parties of the convention, and is being used around the world by governments, by UN organizations, by civil society, by indigenous peoples. The implication of such an approach was that if they succeed, then they make money off of every time that REDD+ term is used. Now, to link it to what's going on here, that same group is proposing one or two mechanisms. There's that other process going on in another room, talking about another body or entity that coordinates the finance for REDD+. Every time they are promoting something that is going to potentially control and validate or verify REDD+ credits, at the same time, if they're looking to trademark it, this is kind of a sketchy-looking business proposal.
Yeah. I talked to Kevin about that, and he said that all they were really looking to do is to create a logo that could differentiate RED from the voluntary markets, like RED under the UN from the voluntary markets, and that it would be given for free.
I mean, why do people trademark things?
I don't want other people using it. I mean, that's why I trademark my website and my podcast, because I don't want other people popping up using it who aren't legitimate. And I've seen this. So this is a legitimate argument, because I've seen at least 2 articles this year from major publications where big enough that they still have fact checkers and they should catch this. But it was about voluntary projects that I knew about, and then they described it as, part of the United Nations effort. So there's confusion between the voluntary markets and what's evolving under the UNFCCC, and he said this is just a way to differentiate that.
I'll pick on 2 points that you raised there. One is why you trademarked your podcast and stuff like that. It's so you have control. Right. You get to decide how it's used. Right. RED Plus was decided by the United Nations under the UNFCCC. Right. So the implication of trademarking this means that now a individual body gets to potentially change or modify what this means. That is not a UN body. Right. So just fundamentally, again, you're trying to privatize a global good. Right. Your second point, which is this evolution, I agree. And it's something that's frustrated me for a long time, where, even when the UN RED program was created, because it's a UN, it's a triumvirate of UN agencies that created the UN program, some people thought, oh, that's RED. It's like, well, no, it's a program that is working to deliver and help countries in their RED Plus activities in various ways. And so from the project side, similarly, on that has evolved. Fewer people get confused by what it is, because the countries themselves have taken ownership over what RED Plus is for them. And now when you look at in countries' NDCs and their national plans, they have RED Plus strategies. And so any discerning buyer, with a simple Google search like, oh, I'm going to, maybe some project developer says, I represent RED Plus in country X. If I'm a potential buyer interested in buying offset credits on a voluntary market, I just have to Google country X RED, and there'll be a number of sources that come up and say, okay, this is their national strategy, is their reference level, the UN site. That company project developer might come up as well in the context of a governance strategy and a registry system or whatever, so it could be fully legitimate. But if it's not, at least it's sort of buyer beware. You know what you're not getting or what you're getting. So I understand that concern, but I do see this evolution of the voluntary market having to, they basically have less and less choice now, but to figure out how to work with governments within this national climate change strategies, which should be, and in many cases are already, sort of devolving to jurisdictions, states or provinces within the country, and there'll be benefit sharing arrangements, whether it's tons of emission reductions once you've aligned reference levels and all that kind of stuff, or whether it's other forms, benefit in other forms to those who are doing the work on the ground. Because we really do have to recognize that many of these projects are good. They are actually having an impact on the ground, both emission reductions, but in sort of livelihood benefits and biodiversity and all that kind of stuff. And we don't want to dissuade good things from happening. Right. But we want to make sure that if we're talking about climate effort, that only emission reductions that are being credited and traded are those that are actually real in terms of what the atmosphere sees.
Peter Graham wrapping up this edition of Bionic Planet, coming to you this week from Global Climate Talks in Bonn, Germany. If you like what you hear, be sure to give me a good rating on whichever service you access me through, or if you like audiobooks, you can sign up for a free 30-day trial at amazontrial.com/Bionic Planet. Or you can become a patron and support me directly at bionic-planet.com for as little as $1 per month. That's all for today. Until next time, I'm Steve Zwick in Bonn, Germany. Thanks for listening.